The first time the galaxy saw a human, they laughed. It happened on a trade station called Veyron Spire, a huge ring of metal floating between three alien empires. Ships from 100 worlds docked there every day. Traders from the Calveth Union sold glowing crystals. Warriors from the Drassic hierarchy walked around in heavy armor, showing off their strength. Scholars from the Old Ones of Ithara studied the stars and looked down on everyone else. Then, one day, a small, battered ship arrived. It had no weapons visible. Its hull was scratched and dented, patched together with metal plates that did not match. The ship's name, painted in plain letters on the side, was simple: Wanderer. The being that walked out was Captain Elena Reyes, a human woman with brown skin, tired eyes, and a plain gray uniform. She was not tall. She had no claws, no scales, no glowing eyes. She had 2 arms, 2 legs, and soft skin that could be cut easily. The aliens on the station stared at her. Some laughed out loud. "This is the species everyone is talking about?" said a Drassic warrior, his voice booming with amusement. "This soft little thing? It looks like it would break if I breathed on it too hard." Elena said nothing. She walked past him, her boots clicking on the metal floor, and went to find the station's trade office. She did not need to prove anything that day. She was just there to trade some ore for fuel and parts. But word spread fast. Humans were weak. Humans were small. Humans had no claws, no armor plating, no venom, no wings. The galaxy decided, in that one moment, that humans were nothing to worry about. They were wrong. But it would take a war, a terrible and bloody war, for the galaxy to understand just how wrong they were. Earth, at that time, was still young in the eyes of the galaxy. Humans had only found the wider universe 80 years earlier, when an old alien probe crashed in the Nevada desert, and scientists managed to reverse engineer a working hyperdrive from its broken parts. Since then, humanity had spread out slowly, building colonies on a handful of nearby worlds: Haven, New Kyoto, Meridian, and a dusty red world called Ashfall that nobody much liked, but everyone needed for its minerals. Humanity was young, small, and, compared to empires that had existed for thousands of years, very weak. The Drassic hierarchy had fleets larger than humanity's entire population. The Calveth Union had technology that could turn a star's light into a weapon. The Ithara Concord, the oldest and most mysterious of the major powers, had ships that could fold space itself. Next to these giants, humanity looked like a child standing among adults, and for a while, the galaxy treated humans exactly like that: a curiosity, something small and harmless to be patted on the head and ignored. That changed the day the Drassic hierarchy decided humanity's colonies would make good farmland. The Drassic were a proud warrior species. They stood over 7 feet tall, with thick gray skin like armor plating, 4 arms, and a taste for conquest that had not faded in 3,000 years of history. They did not believe in subtlety. When the hierarchy wanted something, they took it. Their scouts had been watching the human colonies for 2 years, quietly gathering information. They saw farms with simple fences. They saw cities with police forces but no real military bases. They saw ships built for trade and exploration, not war. The Drassic War Council studied the reports and came to a simple conclusion: humans could not fight back in any meaningful way. Conquering them would be easy, almost boring. General Thurak Voss, a scarred veteran of 100 campaigns, stood before the War Council and gave his opinion bluntly. "These humans have no shields worth mentioning. Their guns fire metal slugs, like children's toys. Their largest warship carries fewer weapons than one of our patrol boats. We could take their capital world in a week and lose almost nothing." The council agreed. And so, without warning, without a declaration, without even bothering to send a formal threat, the Drassic hierarchy launched an invasion fleet toward the human colony of Meridian. Meridian was a farming world, home to nearly 2 million people. It had wide golden fields of wheat, small towns with wooden fences, and a modest orbital defense station that had never once fired its weapons in anger. When the Drassic fleet dropped out of hyperspace above the planet, 300 warships strong, the defenders on the ground had less than an hour of warning. The station commander, a young officer named Marcus Cole, watched the enemy fleet appear on his screen and felt his stomach drop. 300 ships. He had 12. He sent a message to Earth Command, his voice steady even though his hands were shaking. This is Meridian Defense Station. We have an unknown fleet in orbit, designation hostile, numbers approximately 300 vessels, requesting immediate reinforcement. We will hold as long as we can. Earth Command's reply came back grim. Meridian, reinforcements are 11 days away. Do what you can. God be with you. 11 days. Marcus knew what that meant. It meant Meridian was alone. The Drassic did not wait to negotiate. Their fleet opened fire within minutes, and the small defense station, brave as its crew were, was torn apart in less than 20 minutes. Marcus Cole died at his post, still trying to send warnings to the ground colonies below. Then, the Drassic ships began their bombardment. They were not gentle. General Voss believed in making a lesson of the first target, so that no other human world would dare resist. His ships fired on the largest human city on Meridian, a place called New Harrow, home to 400,000 people. The orbital strikes tore through buildings, streets, and homes. Fires spread across the golden fields. Smoke filled the sky, where blue had been only hours before. Within a single day, Meridian's largest city was in ruins. Survivors ran into the fields and forests, carrying what little they could. Drassic ground troops landed soon after, marching through the wreckage, rounding up anyone they found. They were not gentle with prisoners either. The Drassic saw humans as farm animals now, weak and useless for anything but labor. It was, by every measure the Drassic cared about, an easy victory. They had expected it to be easy. What they did not expect was what would happen next. News of Meridian reached Earth 2 days later, carried by a fast courier ship that had barely escaped the bombardment. The message was short, and it was horrifying. Video footage showed burning cities, showed bodies in the streets, showed children being dragged away by Drassic soldiers who laughed as they worked. The president of the United Earth Assembly, a calm and careful woman named Dr. Amara Osei, watched the footage in silence. When it ended, she did not cry, she did not shout. She simply turned to her military advisors and asked one question: how fast can we build ships? The answer was not fast enough, not with the shipyards Earth had. But Dr. Osei had already thought of this problem before the invasion even happened, because she had never trusted the galaxy's peace to last. Quietly, over the past 3 years, Earth had been preparing. New shipyards had been built in secret, hidden in the asteroid belts and behind the moons of Jupiter. New weapons had been designed by teams of scientists working around the clock, weapons based on human ingenuity rather than borrowed alien technology. Humanity had one advantage that the galaxy had never bothered to notice. Humans had spent their entire history fighting wars against each other. World wars, cold wars, wars fought with swords, and wars fought with nuclear missiles. No other species in the galaxy had anything close to that much practical experience with organized violence, because most alien wars were fought slowly, over centuries, with strict rules and traditions. Human wars had no such rules. Humans had learned, over thousands of years, that war was not about honor. It was about survival, and survival meant doing whatever it took to win. Dr. Osei stood before the assembly and made a promise that would echo through history. They came to our home, and they burned a city full of children. They believe we are weak because we do not look like them. They believe we will beg for mercy. I promise you, we will not beg. We will make them regret the day they learned our name. Within a week, Earth's shipyards were working 3 shifts around the clock. Within 2 weeks, the first new warships, small but fast and heavily armed, were launched. Within a month, humanity's first counterattack fleet was ready to move. The Drassic hierarchy, meanwhile, was celebrating. General Voss had been promoted, praised across the Empire as the conqueror of the weak human species. Drassic media mocked humanity openly, showing footage of the burned city on Meridian as proof of the species' helplessness. Alien children across a dozen worlds were told stories about the soft, fragile humans who had folded after a single battle. The rest of the galaxy watched with a mixture of amusement and pity. The Calveth Union sent no aid, believing humanity's fate was already decided. The Athara Concord, ancient and distant, did not even bother to comment. Humanity, it seemed, was already forgotten, a footnote in galactic history. a species that rose for 80 years and fell in a single week. But on Earth, and on every human colony that had not yet been touched by the war, something else was happening. Fear, yes. Grief, yes. But underneath it, something the galaxy had never seen from a young species before. A cold, quiet, burning determination. Marcus Cole's last transmission had been recovered from the wreckage of Meridian Station. His final words, spoken as his station was dying around him, were broadcast across every human colony and every human ship. Tell my family I held the line as long as I could. Tell Earth, don't let this happen again. Whatever it takes, don't let this happen again. The recording had been damaged by the blast that eventually destroyed the station, but engineers managed to piece together enough of the audio to make out those final words clearly. When it played on every screen across every human world, in homes, in schools, in factories, something shifted in the collective spirit of the species. Grief turned into resolve. Fear turned into purpose. It was as though an entire civilization exhaled at once, and then, quietly, began to prepare. Marcus Cole had been an ordinary man before that day. A station commander with a wife and a young daughter back on Earth. A man who had joined the Defense Corps because it offered steady work and decent pay. Not because he had dreamed of dying a hero. But in his final moments, faced with an impossible fight, he had chosen to keep transmitting warnings to the people below, rather than seal himself into an escape pod. His daughter, only 6 years old at the time, would grow up hearing his name spoken with reverence across every human colony, a symbol of quiet, unglamorous courage that asked for nothing in return, except that his sacrifice means something. Those words became a promise that every human who heard them carried with them into the war that followed, whatever it takes. The Jurassic hierarchy had won the first battle. They did not yet understand that they had started a war they could not win, against a species that had never once, in its long and bloody history, learned how to give up. 3 months after the fall of Meridian, humanity's counterattack fleet arrived at the edge of the system. It was not the largest fleet the galaxy had ever seen, it was not the most advanced, but it carried something the Jurassic had never faced before. Soldiers and commanders who had built an entire species worth of tactics on the simple idea that if you cannot outpower your enemy, you outthink them, outendure them, and outlast them. Leading the fleet was Admiral James Okonkwo, a broad-shouldered man with a quiet voice and eyes that had seen too much. He had lost a cousin on Meridian. He was not interested in a fair fight. He was interested in winning. His plan was simple, and it was built entirely around one fact the Jurassic did not know. Humans had studied every scrap of footage from the Meridian invasion, every weapon, every tactic, every weakness in Jurassic ship design. Human engineers had found that Jurassic shields, while powerful against large direct energy blasts, were slow to adjust against many small, fast, unpredictable strikes. It was a flaw born from 3,000 years of fighting honorable traditional battles against enemies who attacked in straight lines. Humans did not fight in straight lines. They never had. Admiral Okonkwo gathered his officers in the flagship's briefing room and laid out the attack. We are not going to meet them in an honorable battle line, because that is what they expect, and that is what will get us killed. We are going to hit them the way we have always fought wars back home, from every angle, at every weak point, without warning, without mercy, and without stopping until the job is done. He looked around the room at the faces of his officers, tired but determined. They burned a city full of families because they believed we were too weak to answer. Let's go answer them. The fleet moved out that night, heading for Meridian, heading for the Jurassic occupation force that still held the shattered colony. None of them knew yet just how long or how brutal this war would become. None of them could have guessed that within 5 years, the name of humanity would no longer bring laughter to alien throats. It would bring silence and fear. The war had only just begun. Before the fleet departed, Admiral Okonkwo spent one final night walking through the shipyards hidden behind the moons of Jupiter, watching the last of the new warships being fitted with weapons and armor. He was not a man given to speeches or grand gestures. He preferred to walk among his crews quietly, listening to their conversations, learning their names, understanding the people he would soon be leading into battle. He stopped near a young engineer named Tomas Reyes, no relation to Elena Reyes, the captain who had once been laughed at on Veyron Spire, though the shared name was something the crew joked about often. Tomas was welding a final plate onto the hull of a destroyer named the Harrow's Answer, named in memory of the city that had burned on Meridian. "You've been at this for 16 hours straight," Okonkwo said, watching the young man work. Tomas did not look up from his welding torch. "My sister was on Meridian, sir. She made it out, but our grandmother did not. I figure I owe this ship a few more hours." Okonkwo said nothing for a long moment. There was nothing to say that would make the grief lighter, and he had learned, over long years of service, that false comfort helped no one. Instead, he simply nodded and moved on, carrying the young engineer's words with him as he continued his walk through the yards. Stories like Tomas's were everywhere that night, and in the weeks and months that followed. Nearly every family on Earth and its colonies had lost someone, or knew someone who had lost someone, in the bombardment of Meridian. Grief had become the fuel that powered the shipyards, the training academies, the long nights spent by scientists searching for any advantage that might help humanity survive what was coming. It was this shared grief, more than any single weapon or tactic, that Admiral Okonkwo believed would ultimately decide the war. The Drassic hierarchy fought because conquest was their tradition, their culture, their expected way of expanding their empire. Humans fought because their homes had been burned, their families murdered, and they intended to make sure it never happened to anyone else. Elsewhere, in the quieter corners of human space, ordinary life tried to continue, even as the war effort consumed more and more of the colony's resources. On New Kyoto, a colony known for its careful blend of traditional culture and modern technology, a school teacher named Haruto Ide gathered his students each morning and taught them not just mathematics and history, but the basics of emergency survival, how to recognize the signs of an orbital bombardment, how to reach shelter quickly, how to care for the wounded with whatever supplies were on hand. "I wish I did not have to teach you these things," he told his class one morning, not long after news of Meridian had reached the colony. "But I would rather you know how to survive than be caught unprepared, the way so many were on Meridian. This is not about fear. It is about being ready, so that fear does not control us when the moment comes." His students, some as young as 7 years old, listened with a seriousness that no child should have needed to carry. But across human space, that seriousness had become common, a quiet, steady resolve that ran through every colony, every city, every family. The galaxy had shown humanity that peace could not simply be assumed. It had to be defended, and humanity, drawing on centuries of hard-won experience with exactly that kind of struggle, intended to defend it with everything it had. As Okonkwo's fleet prepared to depart from Meridian, intelligence officers back on Earth worked tirelessly to piece together everything they could learn about the wider galaxy beyond the Drassic hierarchy. It was clear, even in those early days, that the war would not remain a simple, isolated conflict between two powers. The galaxy was watching, and how humanity conducted itself in this war would shape how every other power viewed the species for generations to come. Director Wen Li, head of Earth's fledgling intelligence service, briefed Dr. Ose personally before the fleet's departure. "We've gathered what we can on the other major powers. The Calveth Union cares mostly about profit and stability. They will not intervene unless it threatens their trade routes. The Athara Concord is old, cautious, and slow to act, but they watch everything. If we do something they consider truly monstrous, they will remember it for centuries. And there are smaller powers, dozens of them, watching to see whether we are a species worth allying with, or a threat worth containing before we grow too strong." Dr. Ose absorbed this information with the same careful attention she gave every briefing. "Then we fight this war the way we must to survive," she said, "but we do not become monsters in the process. Whatever it takes does not mean whatever we want. It means whatever is necessary, and no more. I want that distinction made clear to every officer, every soldier, every commander in this fleet. We are fighting to prove the galaxy wrong about our weakness, not to prove them right about our capacity for cruelty." It was a distinction that Admiral Okonkwo carried with him as his fleet finally departed from Meridian, one that would guide his decisions throughout the difficult years of war that followed. Humanity would fight hard, and it would fight cleverly, using every unconventional tactic its long history of conflict had taught it. But it would not become the same kind of brutal conqueror that had burned New Harrow to the ground. That line, drawn carefully in those early days of the war, would come to define humanity's reputation across the galaxy just as much as its victories on the battlefield. The stars ahead were dark and full of uncertainty, but the fleet moved forward regardless, carrying with it the hopes, the grief, and the quiet determination of an entire species that had decided, once and for all, that it would not be conquered without a fight, the likes of which the galaxy had never witnessed before. Admiral James Okonkwo's fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Meridian system in the dead of night, if space could be called that. No alarms sounded. No warning beacons lit up on the Drassic ships still sitting fat and lazy in orbit around the wounded colony. General Voss had left only a modest garrison behind, 40 warships and a handful of ground battalions, because he did not believe humanity had anything left to fight with. That was his first mistake. Human scout ships, small and quiet, had been slipping through the system's outer asteroid fields for 2 days already, mapping every Drassic ship's position, every patrol route, every gap in their sensor coverage. By the time the main fleet arrived, Okonkwo already knew exactly where to strike. He did not send his ships in a straight line, the way Drassic doctrine expected an attacking force to behave. Instead, he split the fleet into a dozen small groups, each one approaching from a different angle, using the asteroid fields and the glare of Meridian's sun to hide their approach. It was a plan built on patience and deception, 2 things the proud Drassic hierarchy had never valued in war. The attack began with a strike on the Drassic command ship, a massive vessel called the Voss's Glory, named after the general himself. Human fighters, tiny and fast, came in low and struck the ship's engines before its shields could even fully engage. The Drassic crew, caught completely by surprise, scrambled to respond, but it was already too late. Explosions rippled along the hull. The command ship's power core went critical within minutes, and it broke apart in a silent flash of light. With their command ship destroyed, the rest of the Drassic garrison fell into confusion. Human ships struck again and again, never staying in one place long enough to be targeted properly, always moving, always hitting the weakest point in the Drassic formation. It was nothing like the honorable battles the Drassic were trained for. It was fast, brutal, and merciless. Within 6 hours, the Drassic garrison at Meridian was destroyed. 38 of the 40 warships were gone. The remaining 2 fled into hyperspace, carrying news of the defeat back to Drassic High Command. On the ground, the fight was harder and slower, but no less determined. Drassic ground forces still held New Harrow's ruins, using the human survivors as forced labor to rebuild parts of the city for their own use. When human dropships began landing troops outside the city at dawn, the Drassic commander on the ground, a hardened officer named Kelgrath, laughed at the sight of them. "They send soldiers now? After we already broke this world?" he said to his officers. "Let them come. We will show them what happens to those who resist the hierarchy." Kelgrath's confidence did not last long. Human ground troops, trained in guerrilla tactics born from centuries of human conflict, did not attack the city directly. They surrounded it, cut off supply lines, and struck at Drassic patrols in small, fast ambushes before disappearing back into the ruined countryside. Every hour, a few more Drassic soldiers did not return from patrol. Every night, explosions rocked supply depots that had seemed perfectly secure. It was a kind of war the Drassic had never fought before. Their entire military culture was built on direct confrontation, honor, and strength shown openly on the battlefield. Humans, on the other hand, had spent thousands of years learning that war fought in the shadows could be just as deadly as war fought in the open, and often far more effective. After 5 days of this slow, grinding pressure, with his forces worn down and his supplies dwindling, Kelgrath made the decision to retreat from New Harrow rather than be surrounded completely. It was the first time in Drassic history that a garrison had abandoned a conquered world without direct orders to do so. When the human ground forces finally entered New Harrow's ruins, they found the surviving human prisoners still alive, thin and exhausted, but alive. Among them was a woman named Sophia Marlowe, who had lost her husband in the initial bombardment and had spent 3 months as forced labor under Drassic guards. She would later become one of the war's most famous voices, speaking to crowds across Earth and its colonies about what she had witnessed. They thought because we did not have claws or scales, we would break, she said in a speech given months later. They were wrong. We do not break. We remember, and we make sure the ones who hurt us remember too. Meridian was free again, but the cost had been enormous. Nearly 60,000 civilians had died in the initial bombardment and occupation. The scars on the planet, both physical and emotional, would take generations to heal. But the message had been sent, loud and clear, across the stars. Humanity had answered. News of the drastic defeat at Meridian spread through the galaxy far faster than anyone expected. At first, other alien powers refused to believe it. The Drassic hierarchy was one of the most feared military powers in known space. The idea that a young, unarmored, four-limbed species with no natural weapons had destroyed an entire garrison and driven off hierarchy ground forces seemed impossible. But the footage was real. Human ships had recorded the entire battle, and clips of it began circulating on galactic networks, shared and reshared by curious traders, worried diplomats, and shocked military analysts. Alien commentators who had mocked humanity months earlier now studied the footage carefully, trying to understand what had gone wrong for the Drassic. The Calveth Union, always more interested in trade than war, saw an opportunity. Calveth merchants began quietly approaching human diplomats, offering trade deals and technology exchanges, hoping to gain favor with a species that had just proven itself far more dangerous than anyone had guessed. The Athara Concord, ancient and slow to change their opinions, remained mostly silent, though some of their scholars began writing reports on human military psychology, trying to understand a species that fought so differently from anyone else in the galaxy. The Drassic hierarchy, humiliated by the defeat, did not take the loss well. General Voss, who had survived the destruction of his flagship by escaping in a small transport before the battle began, returned to Drassic space in disgrace. The War Council that had once praised him now demanded answers. How does a species with no armor, no claws, and ships smaller than our patrol boats destroy an entire garrison? Demanded High Marshal Draketh, the hierarchy's supreme military commander, a Drassic so old and so scarred that few remembered a time before his leadership. Voss, humbled but not broken, gave the only honest answer he had. They do not fight like warriors, Marshal. They fight like something else. Like predators that have learned every trick a prey animal can use to survive. They strike from the shadows. They lie in wait. They do not care about honor. They only care about winning. Draketh considered this for a long moment. Then he made a decision that would shape the rest of the war. Then we will stop treating this as a small conquest and start treating it as a real war. Full mobilization. Every fleet, every soldier, every weapon the hierarchy possesses will be turned toward crushing this species before it grows any stronger. We made the mistake of underestimating them once. We will not make it again. Back on Earth, the mood was grim but resolute. The victory at Meridian had been celebrated, but Dr. Osei and her military advisors knew it was only the beginning. Drassic space was vast, and the hierarchy's true strength had not yet been brought to bear. Intelligence reports suggested the hierarchy was mobilizing thousands of warships, far more than humanity's young shipyards could hope to match in a direct, ship-for-ship confrontation. Admiral Okonkwo, now hailed as a hero across every human colony, stood before the assembly to give his report. He did not celebrate. He did not smile. He understood, better than most, that the war had only just begun, and that the enemy would not be caught off guard a second time. We won because they underestimated us, he told the assembly. That advantage is gone now. They know what we are capable of. From here on, every battle will be harder than the last. We need more ships. We need more soldiers. And we need to keep thinking of new ways to fight, because if this becomes a war of numbers alone, we will lose. Dr. Osei nodded slowly. Then we will not let it become a war of numbers alone. Humanity has never won its wars through numbers, Admiral. We win through will, through cleverness, and through refusing to accept defeat, no matter the cost. That does not change just because our enemy now comes from the stars instead of from across an ocean. Over the following months, humanity's war machine grew at a pace that stunned even its own leaders. Factories that had once built cars and appliances were converted to build warship components. Universities that had once taught engineering to civilian students now trained thousands of young officers and weapons designers. Every human colony, even the smallest and most remote, contributed something to the war effort: raw materials, manpower, food supplies, or simply the will to keep fighting. Volunteers poured into recruitment centers across Earth and its colonies. Farmers, teachers, factory workers, students, ordinary people who had never imagined fighting a war against aliens now signed up in the millions. They were told, honestly and without exaggeration, what they were facing. Most did not turn back. Among the volunteers was a young woman named Priya Anand, barely 20 years old, who had lost her older brother in the Meridian bombardment. She would go on to become one of the most decorated fighter pilots of the war. But on the day she signed her enlistment papers, she was simply another grieving young person who wanted to make sure no other family suffered what hers had. "I am not doing this because I want to be a hero," she told a recruitment officer, who asked why she had volunteered. "I am doing this because somebody has to make sure this never happens again. It might as well be me." 6 months after the Battle of Meridian, the Drassic hierarchy launched its true invasion. Not a single garrison sent to occupy one colony, but an overwhelming force of over 2,000 warships, aimed directly at humanity's core territory. High Marshal Dracoth himself commanded the fleet, determined to end the war quickly and erase the humiliation of Meridian once and for all. Humanity's scouts detected the fleet's approach 3 weeks before it arrived, giving Earth Command precious time to prepare. Every available ship was called back to defend the home system. Every reserve soldier was activated. Civilian ships were converted into makeshift transports and support vessels. The entire human species braced itself for what everyone understood might be the deciding battle of the war. Admiral Okonkwo addressed the combined fleet before the battle began, his voice carried across every ship in the defense force. "They are coming with more ships than we have ever faced. They believe that raw numbers will be enough to break us this time. They are wrong. We have never been a species that wins by simply having more. We win because we do not stop, because we adapt faster than our enemies can react, and because every single one of us understands exactly what we are fighting for." He paused, looking out at the stars through the viewport of his flagship, knowing that somewhere out there, over 2,000 Drassic warships were closing in on Earth. "This is our home. They will not take it from us. Whatever it takes." The fleet's crews, exhausted from months of preparation but steady in their resolve, echoed the words back through the communication channels, ship after ship, until the phrase became something more than a simple statement. It became a promise, repeated across the entire human fleet, whatever it takes. As the Drassic fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the solar system, the true scale of the coming battle became clear to everyone watching. 2,000 warships, filling the sky like a swarm of dark insects, moving steadily toward a small, blue world that had once been mocked as too weak to matter. The galaxy was about to learn just how badly it had misjudged the human race. In the days before the Drassic fleet arrived, Earth itself transformed in ways that would have seemed unthinkable only a year earlier. Every major city built underground shelters capable of holding thousands of civilians. School buildings were converted into emergency medical centers. Farms across the continents increased production, storing surplus food in case supply lines were cut during the fighting. It was not panic that drove these preparations, but a calm, methodical readiness that came from a species that had, across its long history, learned the hard lessons of what happened to those who were caught unprepared. Dr. Osei made a point of visiting as many of these preparation sites as she could in the weeks leading up to the battle, understanding that her presence, calm and steady, mattered as much to public morale as any speech she could give. At a shelter beneath the city of Lagos, she spoke quietly with an elderly woman named Adaeze Okafor, who had lived through some of Earth's last great wars before humanity ever left its home system. "I never thought I would see something like this again," the old woman said, her hands folded in her lap. "War from the sky, instead of across borders. But I suppose people are still people, wherever the fighting comes from." Dr. Osei sat beside her for a while, saying little, simply offering her presence as a kind of comfort. It was these small human moments, repeated in millions of homes and shelters across the planet, that gave the coming battle its true weight. This was not simply a conflict between fleets and admirals. It was a defense of ordinary lives, ordinary families, ordinary futures that had been threatened by an empire that viewed them as nothing more than an inconvenience to be crushed. Not every human colony had the luxury of full preparation. On the frontier world of Haven, closer to the edge of explored human space, resources were scarce and the population small. When the call came for every able body to help with the war effort, farmers left their fields half-tended, teachers closed their schools, and shopkeepers shuttered their stores, all in order to build makeshift defense platforms out of whatever materials the colony could scrape together. A retired engineer named Dmitry Volkov, who had spent 30 years working on mining equipment before retiring to Haven for its quiet, simple life, found himself leading a team of volunteers cobbling together point defense cannons from old mining lasers and salvaged ship parts. It was crude work, nothing like the advanced weapons being produced in Earth's secret shipyards, but it was work that mattered. "We may not stop a real fleet with these," Dmitry told his team of volunteers one evening, wiping grease from his hands after a long day of work. "But if it buys even a few extra minutes for the ships coming to help us, then it was worth building." This spirit, found not just in Earth's grand shipyards but in every small, struggling colony across human space, became one of the quiet, often unheralded reasons humanity was able to withstand the pressures of the coming war. No one colony, no matter how small or poorly equipped, saw itself as separate from the fight. Every world understood that Meridian's fate could easily have been their own, and every world contributed what it could, however humble, to make certain the next attack, wherever it came, would be met with more than just open fields and unarmed farmers. As the Drassic invasion fleet drew closer to the solar system, tension mounted across every level of human command. Admiral Okonkwo spent the final days before the battle reviewing tactical simulations with his senior officers, refining the details of the ambush that would be sprung in the asteroid belt, checking and rechecking the timing that would determine whether the plan succeeded or resulted in catastrophic failure. Among his officers was Captain Elena Reyes, the very same woman who had once walked, unnoticed and mocked, across the deck of Veyron Spire years earlier. She had spent the years since that day working her way up through the ranks of Earth's growing military, and now commanded one of the stealth vessels that would form the heart of the asteroid ambush. "Do you remember Veyron Spire?" Okonkwo asked her during a final briefing, recalling the story that had become something of a legend among the fleet, a small symbol of how far humanity had come in a short time. "I remember every laugh," Elena said, a faint, hard smile crossing her face. "I think about it more than I probably should, but it taught me something useful. They see us and they think small, soft, harmless. Let them keep thinking that, right up until it's too late for them to think anything at all." Okonkwo nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. It was a lesson the entire species had learned, one way or another, over the past year. That being underestimated was not a weakness, but a weapon, one that humanity intended to use for as long as the galaxy was foolish enough to keep offering it to them. The final hours before the battle passed, in tense, quiet preparation. Ships took their positions among the asteroids. Crews checked their systems one final time, and across every vessel in the fleet, from the largest capital ship to the smallest single-pilot fighter, the same quiet words passed from soldier to soldier, a promise renewed on the eve of the most important battle humanity had yet faced. Whatever it takes. The Battle of Sol, as it would later be called in every history book written after the war, began at exactly 0600 hours Earth Standard Time, when the first Drassic warships crossed into range of humanity's outer defense platforms. High Marshal Draketh had built his plan around a single, brutal idea: overwhelming force. 2,000 warships would not need clever tricks or hidden strategies. They would simply advance in a massive wall, crushing anything in their path through sheer numbers and firepower. It was the kind of plan the Drassic hierarchy had used to conquer dozens of worlds over the centuries, and it had never failed them before. But Earth was not like the worlds the hierarchy had conquered before. Earth had 3 years of secret preparation behind it, an entire species working around the clock, and a defense plan built by minds that had studied every kind of warfare their own bloody history had ever produced. The outer defense platforms, hidden among the asteroids beyond Mars, were the first line of resistance. They were not large, they were not heavily armored, but they were packed with a new kind of weapon that human scientists had developed in secret. Swarms of small, self-guided missiles called Hornets, cheap to build and difficult to shoot down individually, because there were simply too many of them at once. When the Jurassic fleet came within range, the platforms unleashed thousands of Hornets in a single coordinated wave. Jurassic point defense systems, designed to handle a handful of large, slow torpedoes at a time, struggled to cope with thousands of small, fast, unpredictable targets swarming in from every direction. Dozens of Jurassic ships took heavy damage in the opening minutes of the battle. A handful were destroyed outright. It was not enough to stop the fleet, but it was enough to slow it down, and more importantly, it was enough to prove that humanity's new tactics were working exactly as planned. High Marshal Dracoth, watching the battle unfold from his flagship, felt his confidence waver for the first time since the war began. He had expected resistance, but not this kind. Human weapons were not more powerful than his own ships, not individually, but they were used in ways his officers had never trained for, in overwhelming numbers, from unpredictable angles, striking weak points that Jurassic doctrine had never considered vulnerable. "Continue the advance," he ordered, his voice sharp with irritation rather than fear. "We have 2,000 ships. They cannot possibly stop all of them." He was right, in a sense. Humanity could not stop 2,000 warships with missile swarms alone. But Admiral Okonkwo had never intended to win the battle through defense platforms. They were only the opening move, designed to weaken and disorganize the Jurassic fleet before the main human force struck. As the Jurassic fleet pushed deeper into the solar system, past the shattered remains of the outer platforms, they found themselves entering a trap that had been 3 years in the making. Human engineers had spent years studying the asteroid belt, mapping every large rock, every hidden pocket of space where a ship could hide from sensors. Hundreds of human warships had been stationed throughout the belt, powered down and drifting silently among the asteroids, invisible to Jurassic scanners that were designed to detect active engines and weapon systems, not cold, silent hulls disguised as space debris. When the Jurassic fleet reached the heart of the asteroid belt, Admiral Okonkwo gave the order, and the trap was sprung. Hundreds of human warships powered up simultaneously, engines flaring to life in the darkness, weapon systems targeting the Jurassic fleet from every direction at once. It was chaos, sudden and overwhelming, the kind of ambush that no honorable Jurassic commander would have ever considered using, because it went against everything their military culture valued. But it worked exactly as humanity had hoped. The Jurassic fleet, caught in the confusion of the asteroid field with enemy ships appearing from every angle, could not form its usual disciplined battle lines. Ships collided with asteroids trying to evade attacks. Formations broke apart as commanders struggled to identify where the real threats were coming from. Within the first hour of the ambush, over 300 Jurassic warships had been destroyed or disabled. High Marshal Dracoth, furious and increasingly desperate, ordered his fleet to push through the asteroid field as quickly as possible, accepting the losses in order to reach open space, where his numbers could be brought to bear more effectively. It was a reasonable decision, given what he knew, but it played directly into humanity's hands. Beyond the asteroid belt, closer to Earth itself, a second human fleet waited, the main battle force, built from every warship humanity had managed to construct over the past 3 years, crewed by soldiers and pilots who had trained relentlessly for exactly this moment. When the battered, disorganized remains of the Jurassic fleet emerged from the asteroid field, they found themselves facing not a desperate, overwhelmed defense, but a prepared and confident enemy waiting for them. Admiral Okonkwo's voice rang out across the human fleet's communication channels. "This is it. Everything we have built, everything we have trained for, comes down to this moment. They came here to burn our home the way they burned Meridian. We are not going to let that happen. For every family that lost someone to this war, for every world that has suffered under their boots, we finish this here." The battle that followed was the largest and most brutal engagement humanity had ever fought. Human ships, though individually weaker than their Jurassic counterparts, made up for it through coordination, speed, and a willingness to take risks that Jurassic commanders found almost incomprehensible. Human pilots flew maneuvers that Jurassic training manuals would have called reckless, or even suicidal, using them to strike weak points, and then retreat before the enemy could respond. Priya Anand, the young pilot who had lost her brother at Meridian, flew one of the most daring maneuvers of the entire battle. Leading a squadron of 12 fighters, she guided her group directly through a gap in the Jurassic formation, weapons blazing, striking the engines of 3 separate capital ships, before peeling away into a tight, spinning retreat that left enemy gunners unable to track her ship. When she returned to her carrier, her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady as she reported the successful strike. "For Daniel," she whispered to herself, remembering her brother's name, before returning to the battle once more. The fighting raged for nearly 18 hours, longer than any battle the Jurassic hierarchy had fought in over a century. High Marshal Dracketh, watching his once overwhelming fleet dwindle ship by ship, finally understood the truth that General Voss had tried to explain to the War Council months earlier. Humans did not fight like anyone else in the galaxy. They fought like something ancient and dangerous, a species that had spent its entire history learning how to survive against impossible odds. And that experience had made them deadlier than any amount of raw military strength could account for. By the end of the battle, of the 2,000 warships that had entered the solar system, fewer than 400 remained combat-capable. High Marshal Dracketh, faced with the total destruction of his fleet, made the decision no Jurassic commander had made in living memory. He ordered a full retreat. It was a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, and one that would mark the true turning point of the war. The Jurassic hierarchy, an empire that had never lost a major military campaign in 3,000 years, had just suffered its most devastating defeat in its entire history, at the hands of a species it had mocked as weak and helpless, less than a year earlier. As the remains of the Jurassic fleet fled back into hyperspace, cheers erupted across every human ship, every command center, every colony that had held its breath waiting for news of the battle's outcome. Earth had been saved, but the cost had been enormous. Nearly 40,000 human soldiers and pilots had died defending their home, and the scars of that battle, both physical and emotional, would remain with the survivors for the rest of their lives. Admiral Okonkwo, standing on the bridge of his flagship as the last Jurassic ships vanished into hyperspace, did not celebrate. He simply closed his eyes for a long moment, thinking of every soldier under his command who would not be returning home, before opening them again and turning to his officers. "Begin recovery operations. Bring our people home." News of the Battle of Seoul spread across the galaxy faster than any news in recent memory. The Jurassic hierarchy, once one of the most feared powers in known space, had been humiliated by a species barely a century old in the wider galactic community. Alien governments that had ignored humanity entirely now scrambled to understand what had happened, sending diplomats and analysts to study the battle in detail. The Calvith Union, ever practical, saw the writing on the wall and moved quickly to establish formal diplomatic relations with Earth, offering trade agreements and even limited technology sharing in exchange for favorable trade routes through human space. The Athara Concord, though still cautious, began sending scholars to study human history and psychology in earnest, trying to understand how a species so young and so physically unremarkable had managed to defeat one of the galaxy's oldest military powers. But not everyone in the galaxy was impressed. Some alien powers saw humanity's brutal, unconventional tactics not as clever innovation, but as proof of a dangerous, unpredictable nature. Whispers began to spread among the galaxy's other major powers, whispers that would eventually lead to consequences far beyond anything humanity had yet faced. For now, though, Earth allowed itself a moment to breathe. The immediate threat had been turned back. The Jurassic hierarchy, badly wounded and humiliated, would need time to rebuild before it could threaten humanity again. But High Marshal Dracketh, standing before his own War Council upon his return to Jurassic space, made it clear that the war was far from over. "We underestimated them once, and it cost us dearly," he told the Council, his voice heavy with the weight of defeat. "We will not make that mistake again. This war will not end until either the human species is destroyed or our empire is." Somewhere in the depths of Jurassic space, the hierarchy began preparing for a war unlike any it had ever fought before. A long, grinding conflict against an enemy that refused to break, no matter how many times it was struck down. And on Earth, humanity began preparing as well, understanding now, more clearly than ever, exactly what kind of enemy they were facing and exactly what it would take to survive. The galaxy that had once laughed at the sight of a single, small, unarmored human standing on a trade station had now watched that same species destroy the largest invasion fleet in Jurassic history. The laughter had stopped. In its place, across 1,000 worlds, something new had begun to grow: fear. In the aftermath of the battle, Earth's hospitals and recovery centers filled with wounded soldiers, and the true cost of the victory became clear to everyone who had celebrated in the first hours after the Jurassic retreat. Priya Anand visited the recovery ward where several members of her squadron were being treated, including a young gunner named Felix Odero who had lost his right arm in the fighting near the asteroid belt. "They'll fit me with a prosthetic," Felix told her, trying to sound casual about it, though his eyes betrayed how difficult the adjustment had been. "Doctors say it will work almost as well as the real thing, within a few months." Priya sat with him for a long while, saying little, simply present the way soldiers learned to be present for each other after a battle like the one they had just survived. It was in moments like these, quiet and unglamorous, far from the drama of starship combat, that the true weight of the war revealed itself. Victory had been won, but it had not come cheaply, and every family that had lost someone, every soldier who would carry the scars of that day for the rest of their life, understood that the war was far from over. Meanwhile, on Earth, Dr. Osei faced a different kind of battle: the political and diplomatic consequences of humanity's stunning victory. Ambassadors from a dozen alien governments requested urgent meetings, each one trying to understand what humanity's new strength meant for the balance of power across the galaxy. Some came seeking alliance. Others came seeking simply to measure the threat this newly proven species might pose to their own interests. Among the first to arrive was a Calveth trade delegate named Senis Vor, smooth-spoken and calculating, who wasted no time proposing an extensive trade agreement that would give the Calveth Union preferential access to human technology and resources in exchange for formal diplomatic recognition and material support. "The Union has always believed in rewarding strength wisely placed," Senis said during their first meeting, his many-jointed fingers folded neatly in front of him. "You have shown the galaxy something remarkable. We would be honored to call humanity a partner rather than a stranger." Dr. Osei listened carefully, weighing the offer against the practical needs of a species still fighting for its survival. "We welcome partnership built on mutual respect," she replied evenly. "But I will be direct with you, Ambassador. We have learned, through hard experience, to be cautious of those who only notice us once we have proven useful. Any agreement between our peoples will need to reflect that humanity is not simply a resource to be courted, but an equal partner in whatever future we build together." Senis, though clearly hoping for a more eager response, respected the firmness in her answer, and the negotiations that followed, though slow and careful, eventually produced one of the first true alliances humanity would forge with another major galactic power, an alliance that would prove valuable in the difficult years of war still ahead. Not every diplomatic encounter went so smoothly. A delegation from a minor but proud empire called the Zerathi Compact arrived several weeks later, less interested in trade than in delivering a thinly veiled warning. Their lead representative, a tall, sharp-featured being named Osvan Kell, made his people's concerns known plainly during a tense meeting with Earth's foreign ministry. "Your victory has unsettled many across the wider galaxy," Osvan said, his tone carefully polite but unmistakably pointed. "A young species, capable of such devastation against an empire 3,000 years its senior, raises questions that responsible governments cannot simply ignore. We wish only to understand your intentions, and to caution that a galaxy watching a rising power grow too quickly, without restraint, has historically found reasons to intervene before that power grows too large to contain." The warning, though carefully worded, was unmistakable, and it marked the beginning of a quiet unease that would follow humanity throughout the remainder of the war. A suspicion among some of the galaxy's older, more established powers that a species capable of defeating the Jurassic so decisively might, in time, become a threat to the wider order of the galaxy itself. Dr. Osei responded to the warning with the same calm firmness she brought to every difficult conversation. "We fought only to defend our homes, Ambassador Kell. We have no interest in conquest, no desire to threaten any power that does not threaten us first. But I will not pretend that we regret proving ourselves capable of defending what is ours. If that capability unsettles those who assumed we would remain weak forever, I am sorry for their discomfort, but I will not apologize for our survival." The meeting ended without resolution, and the quiet tension it revealed would linger, unspoken but present, in every subsequent interaction between humanity and the galaxy's older powers, a shadow that would eventually grow into something far more consequential as the war ground on. Back at the front, the Drassic hierarchy's defeat at Sol triggered a period of internal turmoil within the Empire itself. High Marshal Draketh faced fierce criticism from rival factions within the hierarchy's leadership, some calling for his removal, others demanding an immediate and even more overwhelming second invasion to erase the humiliation once and for all. Draketh, scarred but not broken by the defeat, argued instead for patience, for a slower, more careful campaign that would account for the unconventional tactics that had cost the hierarchy so dearly. "We do not need more ships," he told the War Council, silencing the loudest voices calling for immediate revenge. "We need to understand our enemy. They do not fight the way we fight. Until we learn to think as they think, more ships will only mean more losses. Give me time to study them, and I will bring you a victory that erases Sol from memory entirely." It was a request the War Council granted reluctantly, buying humanity a period of relative calm in which to continue building its strength, even as, far away in Drassic space, an empire humiliated but far from defeated began patiently preparing for a much longer, much harder war than anyone on either side had originally imagined. 2 years passed after the Battle of Sol, and the war did not end. It only grew larger, colder, and more brutal. The Drassic hierarchy, humiliated but far from defeated, rebuilt its shattered fleets with grim determination. High Marshal Draketh, still in command despite his defeat, changed his strategy completely. No longer would the hierarchy rely on overwhelming numbers alone. Drassic engineers studied captured human wreckage, analyzed footage from the Battle of Sol, and slowly began adapting their own tactics to counter humanity's unconventional style of warfare. At the same time, humanity was not standing still. Earth's shipyards, once hidden in secret behind the moons of Jupiter, now operated openly across a dozen systems, building larger and more advanced warships every month. Human scientists, working with new alliances formed after the Battle of Sol, gained access to alien technology that helped close the gap between human ships and their Drassic counterparts. Shields grew stronger, weapons grew sharper, but the true advantage humanity carried into every battle was not its technology. It was the way humans thought about war itself. The conflict spread across dozens of star systems, no longer a simple defense of Earth, but a sprawling war stretching across human and Drassic territory alike. Colonies changed hands more than once. Entire fleets were destroyed in battles that barely made the news back home, simply because there were now too many battles happening at once to keep track of them all. It was during this long, grinding middle stretch of the war that humanity's reputation across the galaxy began to shift from simple respect into something closer to fear. The change began with a battle at a mining colony called Kestrel's Reach, deep in contested space between human and Drassic territory. A Drassic garrison had taken the colony, using the same brutal occupation tactics that had first ignited the war at Meridian. When a human fleet arrived to retake the colony, they found something they had not expected. The Drassic commander, a bitter officer named Grallic who had lost 2 brothers in the Battle of Sol, had rigged the colony's main reactor to explode rather than let it fall back into human hands. He was prepared to kill every human hostage on the colony, along with his own garrison, simply to deny humanity a victory. Admiral Reina Castillo, commanding the human fleet, made a decision that would become one of the most talked about moments of the entire war. Rather than risk a slow negotiation that might give Grallic time to detonate the reactor, she ordered a small strike team to infiltrate the colony directly, moving through ventilation shafts and maintenance tunnels that Drassic defenders, built for open combat rather than close quarters, struggled to fight effectively in. The strike team, led by a former Special Forces sergeant named Malik Osei, no relation to the president but sharing her quiet determination, fought through the colony's lower levels in brutal, close combat, room by room, using methods that shocked even some of the human soldiers who witnessed them. Malik's team did not take prisoners in that fight. They could not afford to, not with a reactor moments from exploding and thousands of hostages still trapped on the surface. They reached the reactor control room with less than 4 minutes to spare, disabling the detonation sequence just before it would have triggered. Gralak, cornered and out of options, chose to fight rather than surrender, and was killed in the final exchange. The colony was saved, and every hostage survived. But footage of the battle, recorded by Malik's own helmet camera and later released to the public, showed something that spread through the galaxy like wildfire. Humans fighting with a ferocity and a willingness to take extreme risks that no other species in known space could match. It was not simply that humans won battles. It was how they won them, with a coldness and determination that unsettled even seasoned alien military analysts. Word of Kestrel's reach spread quickly, and it marked a turning point in how the wider galaxy viewed the war. Alien news networks that had once portrayed humans as scrappy underdogs now began asking harder questions. What kind of species produced soldiers willing to fight room by room through close, brutal combat without hesitation? What kind of species built strategies around ambush, deception, and total commitment to victory at any cost? The answer, though few in the galaxy wanted to say it plainly, was a species that had spent its entire history at war with itself, and had never fully lost the instincts that history had carved into its culture. The Athara Concord, the oldest and most philosophical of the galaxy's major powers, produced a report during this period that would be quoted for decades afterward. Written by a senior scholar named Vethis Kahl, the report attempted to explain humanity's behavior to the wider galactic community. Humanity is not simply a young species that has learned to fight, the report stated. Humanity is a species whose entire cultural memory is built upon conflict, sacrifice, and survival against impossible odds. Where other species view war as a last resort, humans appear to view it as simply another problem to be solved, with the same creativity, adaptability, and refusal to accept failure that they bring to every other challenge. This is not a flaw in their character. It may in fact be their greatest strength. It is also, we believe, the reason so many of the galaxy's older powers now find themselves deeply unsettled by their rise. The report caused a wave of unease across dozens of alien governments. Some, like the Calvith Union, chose to strengthen their ties with humanity, believing it was better to have such a dangerous species as an ally than an enemy. Others began quietly discussing the idea that humanity's rise might need to be contained before it grew any further. It was around this time that a coalition began to form among several of the galaxy's more cautious powers, worried not just about the drastic human war itself, but about what humanity might become if it won. The coalition, never officially declared as a unified alliance, included quiet support from several minor empires, who feared that a victorious, battle-hardened humanity might eventually turn its attention outward, beyond just defending itself from the Drassic. This hidden pressure reached the Drassic hierarchy in the form of quiet diplomatic support, intelligence sharing, technology transfers, and even limited supplies funneled to Drassic forces through neutral third parties. It was never enough to be called open involvement, but it was enough to keep the war grinding on longer than it otherwise might have, prolonging the suffering on both sides. Dr. Osei, still leading the United Earth Assembly, learned of this hidden support through careful intelligence work, and she addressed it directly in a speech that would later be remembered as one of the defining moments of her leadership. There are those in this galaxy who fear us not because of what we have done, but because of what we might become, she said, her voice calm but unmistakably firm. They watch us fight for our survival, and see, in our determination, a threat to their own comfortable place in the galaxy's order. I say this plainly. We did not choose this war. It was brought to our home, to our children, to our families. We have fought only to protect what is ours. If the price of that survival is that the galaxy learns to fear us, then so be it. We did not ask to be feared. We only asked to be left alone. It was the galaxy that decided otherwise. Her words were broadcast not just across human space, but picked up and translated across dozens of alien networks. For many in the galaxy, it was the first time they truly understood the depth of humanity's resolve, and the first time many of them began to wonder if the old, comfortable order of the galaxy, built on the assumed superiority of ancient empires over younger species, might be coming to an end. Back on the front lines, the war ground on. Admiral Okonkwo, now leading the primary human offensive into contested territory, pushed deeper into space that had once belonged solely to the Jurassic hierarchy. His forces captured a series of key shipyards and supply depots, slowly strangling the hierarchy's ability to rebuild its fleets as quickly as it once had. High Marshal Draketh, watching his empire's strength slowly erode under the pressure of a war he had once believed would be over within a week, made a desperate decision. He ordered a massive strike deep into human territory, aimed not at a military target, but at Ashfall, the dusty red mining colony that supplied much of the raw material for humanity's war machine. If he could not defeat humanity's fleets directly, he reasoned, he could cripple their ability to continue fighting. The attack on Ashfall was smaller than the invasion of Meridian had been years earlier, but it was no less brutal. Jurassic ships bombarded the colony's mining facilities, destroying critical infrastructure and killing hundreds of workers in the process. It was meant to be a crippling blow. Instead, it became the spark that ignited humanity's final, decisive push of the war. News of the Ashfall attack reached Earth within hours, and the reaction across human space was immediate and furious. Volunteers who had already been fighting for years re-enlisted for further tours of duty. Factories increased production even further. Every human colony, without exception, pledged additional resources to the war effort, determined to make sure the hierarchy paid dearly for the attack. Admiral Okonkwo, now recognized as humanity's greatest military commander, requested and received authorization for what would become the largest human offensive of the entire war. A direct strike toward Draskar Prime, the capital world of the Jurassic hierarchy itself. It was an enormous risk. Draskar Prime was defended by the largest concentration of Jurassic military strength anywhere in the Empire, protected by layers of shipyards, defense platforms, and veteran fleets that had spent years preparing specifically for such an attack. Many of Okonkwo's own advisors argued against the plan, believing it was simply too dangerous, too likely to end in catastrophic losses that humanity could not afford. But Okonkwo, standing before the assembly to present his plan, made his case with the same quiet determination that had carried humanity through every battle of the war so far. They struck at our ability to fight, hoping to break our will. They have shown us, again and again, that they will not stop unless they are forced to. We have spent this entire war reacting to their attacks, defending what is ours. It is time to show them what it truly means to face humanity on the offensive. If we can strike at the heart of their empire and force them to negotiate from a position of weakness, we can end this war faster and save more lives in the long run than years of continued defensive fighting ever could. Dr. Osei considered the plan carefully, understanding the enormous risk it carried, but also understanding that the war, as it stood, could drag on for years more, costing countless additional lives on both sides. Finally, she gave her approval. "Take the fight to them, Admiral. Finish this." The fleet that assembled for the assault on Draskar Prime was the largest and most powerful humanity had ever built. Over 3,000 warships, crewed by veterans who had fought in every major battle of the war, armed with the most advanced weapons human science and captured alien technology could produce. It was, by any measure, humanity's greatest gamble. As the fleet prepared to jump into hyperspace, bound for the heart of Jurassic territory, Admiral Okonkwo addressed his crews one final time. "This is the battle that decides everything. If we succeed, we end this war on our terms. If we fail, everything we have fought for these past 2 years may be lost. I will not pretend this will be easy, but I have never once doubted the resolve of the men and women under my command. We have proven, again and again, that this galaxy underestimated us. Let us prove it one final time." The fleet vanished into hyperspace, carrying with it the hopes of every human colony, every survivor of Meridian and Ashfall, every soldier who had fallen in the 2 years of brutal fighting that had led to this moment. Somewhere ahead of them, at the very heart of the Jurassic hierarchy, High Marshal Draketh prepared his empire's final defense, understanding, perhaps for the first time, that the war he had started with such confidence might end with the complete collapse of everything the hierarchy had built over 3,000 years. The final battle of the war was about to begin. In the weeks leading up to the departure of the Great Fleet, life across human space carried a strange, heavy quality, a mixture of grim determination and quiet hope that this massive gamble might finally bring the long war to an end. On Ashfall, still recovering from the recent Drassic bombardment, survivors worked alongside military engineers to repair the colony's mining facilities, even as they said goodbye to sons and daughters who had volunteered to join the offensive fleet. Among them was a young miner named Teodor Basaran, who had lost his father in the attack on the colony's processing plant. He had never intended to join the military, content instead to follow his father's trade deep in the tunnels beneath Ashfall's red soil. But grief had changed his plans, and he found himself standing in a recruitment line only days after burying what little of his father's remains could be recovered. "I am not doing this for glory," he told the recruiting officer, a tired woman named Sergeant Halverson who had processed thousands of volunteers over the past 2 years. "I am doing this because if I do not, I will spend the rest of my life wondering if I could have stopped it happening to someone else." Sergeant Halverson had heard variations of this same sentiment more times than she could count, from farmers and teachers and shopkeepers across every human world, each one carrying their own private grief into a war that had, by now, touched nearly every family across human space in some way. It was this depth of shared loss, more than any single tactic or weapon, that had carried humanity through 2 years of brutal, grinding conflict, and it was this same depth of feeling that now propelled the largest fleet in human history toward the heart of enemy territory. Admiral Okonkwo, in the final days before departure, met privately with Dr. Osei to discuss the enormous risk the offensive represented. It was a conversation neither of them took lightly, understanding that the decision they were about to make could either end the war on favorable terms or cost humanity a devastating portion of the military strength it had spent years building. "If this fails," Okonkwo said quietly, sitting across from the president in her private office, "we will have lost the bulk of our fleet, deep in enemy territory, with nothing left to defend our own worlds if the hierarchy decides to counterattack while we are weak." Dr. Osei considered this carefully, her eyes distant as she weighed the terrible calculus of war that had, by now, become an unwelcome but familiar part of her daily responsibilities. "And if we do nothing," she said finally, "the war continues indefinitely, and every year that passes costs us more lives, more resources, more of the future we are trying to protect. I have read every report, Admiral. I trust your judgment more than almost anyone alive. If you believe this plan can work, then we take the risk, together, and we accept whatever comes of that decision." It was this shared willingness to accept enormous risk in pursuit of a decisive end to the suffering, rather than a slow, grinding continuation of it, that defined humanity's leadership throughout the war's most difficult years. Neither Okonkwo nor Osei took the decision lightly, but both understood, in the end, that half measures had never been the path that led a young, struggling species to defeat one of the galaxy's oldest empires. Only total commitment, carefully aimed and boldly executed, had ever given humanity a chance against odds that should, by any reasonable measure, have crushed them from the very beginning. As the fleet's departure grew near, word of the coming offensive spread quietly through diplomatic channels across the galaxy, and reactions varied widely among the powers who had been watching humanity's war with the Drassic hierarchy with growing unease. The Calvith Union, true to its practical nature, quietly increased its trade cooperation with human shipyards in the final weeks before the offensive, hoping to secure favorable relations with whichever side ultimately proved victorious. The Athara Concord sent a formal, if largely symbolic message, urging restraint, worried that a human strike at the very heart of Drassic territory might set a precedent that could destabilize the wider galactic order for generations to come. Vethis Kal, the Athara scholar whose earlier report on human psychology had caused such unease across the galaxy, wrote a final assessment in the days before the offensive that would later be studied extensively by historians of the war. "If humanity succeeds in this offensive," Kal wrote, "it will mark the first time in recorded galactic history that a species less than a century into interstellar contact has decisively defeated an empire of the hierarchy's age and power, not merely in defense, but through direct, offensive conquest of the enemy's own capital system. Whatever the outcome, the galaxy's understanding of what a young species can accomplish, given sufficient will and sufficient cause, will never be the same again. It was a prediction that would prove entirely accurate, though not even Call, with all his careful study of human history and psychology, could have fully anticipated just how profoundly the coming battle would reshape the galaxy's understanding of what humanity truly was, and what it was capable of becoming. The human fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Draskar system, and for a long moment, every officer on every ship simply stared at what awaited them. Draskar Prime, the capital world of the Drassic hierarchy, was surrounded by layers of defense unlike anything humanity had faced before. Massive orbital fortresses, each one larger than any single human warship, ringed the planet in overlapping fields of fire. Thousands of Drassic warships, gathered from every corner of the Empire, waited in tight defensive formations. Minefields of automated weapon platforms drifted silently between the fortresses, ready to tear apart any ship that came too close without the proper authorization codes. High Marshal Draketh had spent 2 years preparing for exactly this moment, certain that humanity's aggressive tactics would eventually lead them to attempt a strike at the heart of his empire. He had built the most heavily defended position in Drassic history, determined that no enemy fleet, however clever, however determined, would break through. Admiral Okonkwo studied the tactical display on his flagship's bridge, taking in the scale of the defenses arrayed against his fleet. It was, by any reasonable measure, an impossible fight. 3,000 human warships against a defense network built specifically to stop them, backed by the full remaining strength of the Drassic military. But Okonkwo had not come this far by fighting the battles his enemies expected him to fight. "We are not going to attack the fortresses directly," Okonkwo told his assembled officers, gathered across a dozen ships through secure communication links. "Draketh has built this defense expecting us to try to smash through it with brute force, the same way his people once tried to smash through us at Meridian. We are going to do what we have always done. We are going to make them fight the battle we choose, not the one they prepared for." His plan was audacious, built on months of careful intelligence gathering and a deep understanding of how the Drassic military thought. Human engineers had developed a new class of stealth ship over the past year. Small vessels coated in materials that scattered sensor scans, nearly invisible to Drassic detection systems at anything beyond close range. A full third of Okonkwo's fleet consisted of these stealth vessels, hidden among the rest of the fleet's more conventional ships, waiting for the right moment to strike. The battle began not with a direct assault, but with a feint. The bulk of humanity's conventional fleet advanced toward the outer defense fortresses, drawing the attention of Drassic forces and triggering exactly the kind of massive, direct confrontation that Draketh had prepared for. Drassic warships surged forward to meet the human advance, confident that their superior numbers and prepared positions would grind down the attacking force. For the first several hours of the battle, it appeared that Draketh's strategy was working. Human losses mounted steadily as they pressed against the outer defenses, and Drassic commanders began to believe they were witnessing the beginning of a decisive hierarchy victory. But the true attack had not yet begun. While the main battle raged at the outer fortresses, Okonkwo's stealth fleet slipped quietly through gaps in the Drassic sensor net, moving along a carefully mapped path that avoided the heaviest concentrations of enemy ships. Guided by months of intelligence work and the same patient, methodical planning that had won the Battle of Seoul 2 years earlier, the stealth fleet made its way deep into the heart of the defense network, undetected, until it was close enough to strike directly at the orbital fortresses' command centers and the shipyards that supported them. When Okonkwo gave the signal, the stealth fleet revealed itself all at once, striking with devastating precision at the most critical points in the Drassic defense network. Fortress command centers, caught completely by surprise, were destroyed before their crews even understood they were under attack. Shipyards that had been building reinforcements for Draketh's fleet were crippled in a matter of minutes. The sudden, coordinated strike threw the entire Drassic defense into chaos. Fortresses that had been coordinating their fire against the main human fleet suddenly found themselves unable to communicate with each other, their command structures shattered by the stealth attack. Drassic ships that had been holding disciplined formations began to scatter, uncertain of where the true threat was coming from. High Marshal Draketh, watching his carefully prepared defense collapse into confusion, understood in that moment that he had once again underestimated his enemy. He had prepared for a war of brute strength, believing that overwhelming defense would be enough to stop any human assault. He had not prepared for an enemy willing to spend months in patient, careful planning, hiding an entire fleet in plain sight until the perfect moment to strike. "Rally the fleet," Draketh ordered, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Do not let their trick fleet distract us from the true battle. Concentrate all fire on the main human force." But it was too late. With the outer defenses in chaos and the fortress network crippled, Okonkwo's main fleet pressed its advantage, pushing through the weakened Drassic lines with everything they had left. What had begun as a desperate, costly assault against overwhelming defenses had transformed, through patience and careful deception, into a battle humanity could actually win. The fighting around Draskar Prime raged for nearly 2 full days, the longest continuous battle of the entire war. Both sides suffered enormous losses. Human ships that had fought through years of brutal warfare were pushed to their absolute limits, crews operating on exhaustion and pure determination as the battle stretched on far longer than anyone had anticipated. Priya Anand, now a squadron commander after years of combat experience, led one of the final decisive strikes of the battle, guiding her fighters through a gap in the collapsing Drassic lines to strike directly at Draketh's own flagship. It was a mission with a low chance of survival, but Priya, like so many humans who had fought through this long and terrible war, had long since made peace with the risks she took in service of ending it. Her squadron's strike crippled the flagship's engines and weapons systems, leaving High Marshal Draketh's vessel dead in space, surrounded by human warships closing in from every direction. With his flagship disabled and the remnants of his fleet scattered and in retreat, Draketh finally understood that the battle, and with it the war, was lost. Rather than continue a fight that could only end in the complete destruction of what remained of his fleet, and quite possibly the bombardment of Draskar Prime itself, High Marshal Draketh made the hardest decision of his long military career. He opened a communication channel to Admiral Okonkwo's flagship and requested terms of surrender. The negotiations that followed were difficult, marked by years of accumulated grief and anger on both sides. Dr. Osei herself traveled to a neutral station to oversee the final terms personally, determined that whatever agreement was reached would be one that reflected humanity's core values, even in victory. "We did not fight this war for conquest," she told the assembled Drassic negotiators, her voice steady, despite the weight of everything that had led to this moment. "We fought because you came to our home and tried to take it from us. We do not want your worlds. We do not want your resources. We want only to be left in peace, and we want justice for what was done to Meridian, to Ashfall, and to every family that lost someone in this war." The final treaty, signed months later after difficult negotiations, required the Drassic hierarchy to pay significant reparations to humanity, to formally recognize human territorial sovereignty, and to submit to strict limitations on military forces stationed near human space for a period of 50 years. It was not a treaty of total conquest, though many in the human military had argued for harsher terms after everything the hierarchy had done. Dr. Osei had insisted on restraint, believing that a peace built on excessive punishment would only sow the seeds of future conflict. "We have shown this galaxy what we are capable of in war," she said, explaining her reasoning to a room of skeptical military advisors. "Now we must show them what we are capable of in peace. That is a victory too, and in some ways, a harder one to win." The war's end sent shockwaves through the wider galaxy. The Drassic hierarchy, once one of the most feared empires in known space, had been humbled by a species that, less than 5 years earlier, had been mocked as too weak and too primitive to matter. Every major power in the galaxy took notice, sending diplomats to Earth, eager to establish relationships with a species that had proven itself capable of not just surviving against overwhelming odds, but of decisively winning. The mood across the galaxy shifted from curiosity to respect to something closer to caution. Alien parents, who had once told their children stories mocking the fragile, clawless humans, now told different stories, of a species that never gave up, that turned every disadvantage into a strength, that fought with a ferocity and creativity unlike anything the galaxy had seen before. Humans were no longer seen as small or weak. They were seen as something else entirely, a young species that had earned its place among the galaxy's great powers through blood, sacrifice, and unbreakable will. On Veyrun Spire, the same trade station where a human captain had once been laughed at for her plain uniform and soft skin, a new generation of alien traders now greeted human ships with careful respect, remembering the stories of what this small, unassuming species had accomplished. No one laughed anymore. Years later, Admiral Okonkwo, now retired from active service, stood before a memorial built on the outskirts of New Harrow, the city on Meridian that had been the first to suffer under Drassic occupation. The city had been rebuilt, its golden fields restored, its people slowly healing from the wounds of a war that had changed everything. The memorial listed the names of every human who had died in the war, tens of thousands of names carved into black stone, stretching farther than the eye could easily follow. Okonkwo walked slowly along the wall, his fingers occasionally brushing against names of soldiers he had commanded, friends he had lost, a whole generation of humanity that had given everything to protect their home. Priya Anand, now a respected instructor training the next generation of pilots, stood beside him, having come to pay her respects to her brother Daniel, whose name was carved near the beginning of the wall. "Do you think it was worth it?" she asked quietly, looking out over the endless list of names. Okonkwo considered the question carefully before answering, as he considered most things these days. "I think we did what we had to do," he said finally. "We did not choose this war. We only chose not to lose it. Whether it was worth it, that is not a question for us to answer. It is a question for the ones who come after us, the ones who get to live in the peace we fought for. We can only hope they build something worthy of what was given to make it possible." Above them, in the golden evening sky of Meridian, ships moved peacefully between the stars, human vessels traveling alongside ships from a dozen other species, trading, exploring, building a future together that would have seemed impossible only a few years before. The galaxy that had once mocked humanity's name had learned, through blood and fire, exactly what that name truly meant. And though the fear that now accompanied humanity's reputation was not something Dr. Osei or Admiral Okonkwo had ever wanted, both understood that it had bought their species something far more valuable than mere respect. It had bought them peace, earned the hardest way possible, and a place among the stars that no one in the galaxy would ever again dare to take for granted. Humanity had entered the wider galaxy as a joke, small and unremarkable among giants. It left the war that followed as something else entirely, a name spoken carefully across 1,000 worlds, remembered not for what humans looked like, but for what they had proven themselves capable of when everything they loved was threatened. Never again would the galaxy make the mistake of underestimating them. In the months following the treaty's signing, humanity faced the difficult task of rebuilding, not just its damaged colonies, but the very structure of its society, which had spent nearly 5 years organized almost entirely around the demands of total war. Factories that had built warships slowly returned to building civilian goods. Soldiers who had spent years fighting across the stars returned home to families who had grown and changed in their absence, faces they barely recognized after so long apart. Sophia Marlowe, who had survived the occupation of New Harrow and become one of the war's most recognized voices, dedicated herself in the years after the peace treaty to helping other survivors process the trauma of what they had endured. She established support centers across Meridian, and eventually across other colonies as well, staffed by counselors trained specifically to help people who had lived through bombardment, occupation, and the long, grinding uncertainty of war. "We won," she told a gathering of survivors during the dedication of the first center. "But winning does not erase what happened to us. It does not bring back the people we lost. What we can do now is make sure that the people who are still here, who are still trying to find their way back to something like a normal life, are not left to carry that weight alone." Her work, quiet and unglamorous compared to the great battles fought among the stars, became just as essential to humanity's recovery as the treaties signed by diplomats and the reconstruction funded by reparations from the Drassic hierarchy. War, humanity had learned once again, did not end simply because the fighting stopped. It left marks that needed tending long after the guns fell silent. The relationship between humanity and the Drassic hierarchy, unsurprisingly, remained tense and complicated in the years following the treaty. High Marshal Dracoth, stripped of much of his authority, but not formally removed from his position as part of the negotiated peace, spent his remaining years attempting to understand the species that had humbled his empire so completely. In a private correspondence with Admiral Okonkwo, exchanged occasionally in the years after the war, he offered a kind of grudging respect that surprised many who had followed the conflict closely. "I have spent my entire life believing that strength was measured in armor, in claws, in the size of one's fleet," Draketh wrote in one such letter. "You have taught me, at great cost to both our peoples, that strength can also be measured in the refusal to accept defeat, no matter how impossible the odds. I do not know if our peoples will ever be true friends, but I have come to respect what your species is capable of, and I suspect that respect, however uncomfortable, may be the beginning of something better than the war that brought us to this point." Okonkwo, for his part, replied with characteristic honesty, "Respect earned through war is a strange foundation for peace, Marshal, but I have learned not to reject any foundation that might hold. Perhaps our children, or theirs, will build something better on top of it than either of us managed." Elsewhere across the galaxy, the wider consequences of humanity's victory continued to unfold in ways both expected and surprising. Smaller species who had lived for generations under the shadow of larger, more powerful empires began looking to humanity's example with a mixture of hope and caution, wondering whether their own struggles for independence and dignity might one day find similar success. Diplomats from a dozen minor worlds quietly reached out to Earth in the years following the war, seeking not military alliance, but simply guidance, wisdom born from humanity's own hard-won experience of standing firm against an empire that had once believed itself unstoppable. Dr. Ose, in the later years of her presidency, became something of an unlikely figure of galactic diplomacy, known across dozens of worlds not just as the leader who had guided humanity through its darkest war, but as a voice of careful, principled restraint in a galaxy that had, for millennia, operated largely on the assumption that might alone determined right. She continued to insist, in every meeting, every treaty negotiation, every quiet conversation with worried ambassadors, that humanity's strength was not something to be feared without reason, but something that could, if the galaxy chose wisely, become a source of stability rather than threat. "We did not ask for this reputation," she said in one of her final major speeches before eventually stepping down from leadership. "We did not seek to become a name that other species whisper with caution. We only wanted to live, to build, to raise our children in peace, the same as any other people in this vast galaxy. If our determination to protect that simple wish has earned us a fearsome reputation, then I hope, in time, the galaxy comes to understand that fear and respect are not always the same thing, and that a species capable of such fierce defense of its home is also capable of building something worth trusting, if given the chance." Years later, long after Admiral Okonkwo had retired and Dr. Ose had stepped down from public life, a new generation of humans grew up hearing the story of the war not as a lesson in violence, but as a lesson in resilience. The story of a small, unremarkable species that had been mocked and underestimated, that had lost so much in the opening days of a war it never wanted, and that had, through grief, determination, and an unbreakable refusal to accept defeat, transformed itself into one of the galaxy's most respected and, yes, most carefully regarded powers. The war was over, but the story of what humanity had become would be told for generations to come, on Earth and among the stars alike, a reminder that strength was not always found in size, or claws, or ancient power, but sometimes in the simple, unbreakable will of a small, soft species that had refused, against all odds, to ever give up.